which takes us to item 5, public input. Members, there are 6 requests, and there is a requirement under the standing orders to accept the 6 requests for public input, and they all relate to the item on the agenda, which we're going to shortly. I'll just run through the parties and how I think we could hear from the parties and then pose questions. We have Julie Scott from the Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust on affordable housing and inclusionary zoning. On the same topics, we have Brendan Rigby and also Tom Gill. Then we go to the 4th contributor, which is Samuel Johnston. And then we go to Imogen Schutz, and the 6th is Ellie Croft. Now, I'll tell you a bit more about where each of those is from as they come before us, but I'm proposing that we go through all 6 and then pose questions at the end. And I would suggest that we limit it to 1 question per councillor, considering the time limit of 30 minutes under our standing orders all up. So I would hope now that we can hear from Julie Scott. Julie, are you with us on the line?
Yes, hello. I don't know if you can see us here.
Thank you, Julie. Now, we've got a little bit of echo. It might be your end. If there's anything that needs to be turned off there, or if you're nice and close to your microphone and there's no other interference, if you could just check that. And Julie, you're from the Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust, and you'd like to speak to us about the paper before us, which is our item 8, the Affordable Housing Report Back.
Yes, that's correct. Is the echo any better now?
Thank you, Julie. Julie, our standing orders provide 5 minutes, so we're very willing to hear you for the next 5 minutes on the key points that you'd like to raise. In your hands.
Okay. Great. Can you see, can I just confirm you can see the PowerPoint presentation okay?
At this stage, we cannot.
We'll just try and fix that up. So just while I'm actually here with Katie Russell, who's a policy planner from the Queenstown Lakes District Council. We have quite a close relationship with council. So we're a not-for-profit trust. We were set up 13 years ago. We're actually created by council as a key recommendation that came out of their housing strategy in 2005. So we are a pretty small operation in terms of staffing numbers. We've got 1.9 full-time equivalents. We have a board of 6 trustees. We also have 3 councillor liaisons who come along to our board meetings, and they don't have voting rights, but they just provide feedback in terms of what council might think about what we're doing. We have a relationship framework agreement with council, which sort of outlines our responsibilities and requirements, but the main part of that relationship framework agreement is actually the inclusionary zoning. So how this works, and I'm sure you all have some understanding, so I've just kept it brief here. Hopefully you can see the PowerPoint by now. But it's all about sharing the value uplift that's created through the rezoning of land. So that's the upzoning of land when land is, say, rezoned from rural to residential. And the premise behind that is that uplift of value, there should be a little bit of that should be shared back with the community to facilitate more affordable housing. So this is enabled through council planning processes such as private plan changes and special housing areas. It comes across to us either in the form of land or cash. That depends on the development itself and the developer. Sometimes if it's a very high-end residential development, they may not want affordable housing down there, and we may not be able to build affordable housing down there. So sometimes we negotiate a cash outcome instead, but typically it's around 5 to 10% of the titled sections that are created will come across to our housing trust at nil consideration. So that's pretty significant, you can imagine, and we retain that. Any sections that come across to us, we retain in perpetuity for the foreseeable future. Can you see the PowerPoint yet?
We can see we've seen the first slide, and we're now on to the second slide, which has got the pie chart.
Brilliant. So that gives you a really good indication of how we're funded. So over the years, we've received Crown grants, and that's the reason that we're an independent trust rather than a council-controlled organisation. It enables us to tap into Crown funding as well as inclusionary zoning. So over the years, we've received close to $5 million from the Crown. We've received around $1.5 million from local council, and that includes an operational grant each year of $50,000 and one-off land contributions, council-owned land. But clearly the bulk of our funding comes from, I'll put here, developers. That is through the inclusionary zoning process. So you can see how significant that is for us. And of course, I'm keeping this really short, the outcome for us is that we receive land, we build housing, and we help people into homes. To date, we've helped 177 households through a variety of our programs. So we've got shared ownership, which is similar to the Housing Foundation model, if you're aware of that in Auckland. We don't actually offer that program anymore. We stopped offering that about 2 years ago, and we've moved to a new leasehold program, which is called Secure Home. And under that model, we retain the land in perpetuity, so it doesn't enable us to sell it off. And so that's quite similar to the community land trust model, where the land is held by the trust in perpetuity. This development that you're looking at here was our very first one, so we cut our teeth on it really. 27 houses. We bought the land with cash that we received from the Jacks Point developers, and at the time the Crown chipped in with $1 million as well. I haven't put all of our developments up here, I've just put a few. This land here, we received a piece of bulk land actually from the developer of the Shotover Country private plan change. By right, we were entitled to 26 titled sections, but we actually went back to the developer and said, how about we get a piece of bulk land that's the equivalent value of 26 titled sections, and we'll do the civil works, we'll put in the infrastructure, and we can create a truly comprehensive development and get more bang for our buck. So we ended up with 44 houses. We put 3/4 of them into 3-bedders and 1/4 into 2-bedders, and we've got a mixture of tenures. Yeah. And lastly, we've got our Tyrrell Lane development, which we launched last year, and this is where we launched our Secure Home program, our leasehold model. So we've currently got 630 households on our waiting list. They're a mixture of about 1/4 of them are singles, 15% of them are couples, 20% of them are single parents, and around 40% of them are couples with children. And so families, the traditional family model, and then 3% of them are seniors. So it's a really good mix, and that's what we're all about. I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Fantastic, Julie. Thank you so much. And look, we appreciate you accommodating your presentation in that 5 minutes and a bit. What I'd like to do, Julie, is go through the other presenters, and then we'll take some questions from the members of the Planning Committee at the end. So thank you, Julie, and we'll come back to Julie if we have questions for her later. We'll now go to Brendan Rigby. Brendan, are you with us, please?
Kia ora, Mr. Chair. Yes, I am.
Kia ora, Brendan. If you could take your 5 minutes now, please.
Sure. Kia ora, Chair Darby. Thanks for the opportunity to come and speak with you. Kia ora koutou, councillors and members of the board and all of the others of you on the Skype. Kia ora, I'm Brendan Rigby. I work for Community Housing Aotearoa, and I project lead a project called the Shift Aotearoa. Duncan, if you just flick through the slides as we go, I'll just pretty much speak to them anyway. I try and make my points fairly simply. The Shift Aotearoa, as you can see there, Community Housing Aotearoa has a vision of all New Zealanders well housed. Many of you are probably familiar with Char and Char's work. The Shift Aotearoa is a philanthropically funded project which is really focused on the right to housing in Aotearoa. and we'll talk about that a little bit through the presentation. I guess just a couple of things. First up, I'd like to thank, especially on behalf of Community Housing Aotearoa, the officers who have been involved in progressing this work over the last few years. Really nice to see this report coming back before the committee. And I've got on slide 3 a set of proposals that I'll just really leave with you, speak to them too much, but just to reinforce that Community Housing Aotearoa are very happy to and well placed to coordinate further work with the community housing sector, in particular on inclusionary zoning, but really any other matters relating to this affordable housing policy. It's a key interest of Community Housing Aotearoa and the shift, so we welcome any further reach out or opportunity to participate in that work, especially if we can help to bring sector members together to speak with. So I'll just jump now a little bit into really the kaupapa of this brief presentation. As Duncan's just very astutely done, popped up a slide from Leilani Faha, Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, who was here in February. And the reason I picked this quote is because I'm going to talk to you about human rights law, but actually Leilani was really incredibly succinct in saying, actually, this law, this human rights law, is about dignity. It's about people being able to live in peace, security, and dignity. And when I look through the papers that you've had before you for this particular agenda item, I think there is an element that's missing. It's very easy to get tied down into the infrastructure and the funding mechanisms and the relationship with central government, and I completely understand that. But I really like the way that the human rights space brings us back to this place of realising that it's really important to protect the peace, security and dignity of our citizens and ratepayers. So that's why I'm interested in elevating and surfacing this human rights kaupapa. And I'll just, briefly run over the 3 things that we're proposing. One is that CHA would be happy to support any workshopping or information sharing on the human right to housing with council, elected members or officers. Likewise, in relation to inclusionary zoning. And Mr. Chair, if I may be so bold, I have proposed a resolution. Obviously, that's in your hands whether you wish to discuss that or not. So moving on through my presentation, I just want to make a very brief point that there's actually 2 sources of the right to housing in New Zealand, not just the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or other similar declarations. We actually have the right to housing embedded in Te Tiriti o Waitangi. As we can see here and on the following slide where it's translated. The right to home is different. The treaty right to home is different and complementary to the human right to adequate housing. But in a sense, it kind of provides us with a constitutional source of the right to housing. And again, I won't dwell on that due to timing, but just to be cognizant of that. The right to home is really well established in international law. It's been very well defined by the UN and other bodies. There's 7 recognised elements to the right, and I think when we read through them, they're pretty self-explanatory, but they're also pretty powerful. They're not left field, they're not crazy. If you go back to my earlier statements, I think they provide 7 really powerful ways of thinking about the dignity of families living in homes. And I think you can hopefully agree that, if all of these 7 things were being delivered really effectively, we'd be a long way down a track towards much better housing outcomes for our communities. So jumping from those 7 elements, just wanted to jump into really Leilani Faha. She's really pushed for 2 things. One is the development of local domestic guidelines on the guidance on the right to housing, which the Human Rights Commission is currently developing. And the other is the development of human rights-based housing strategies. And we recognise at CHA that nationally in New Zealand, many local authorities are actually talking about and thinking about developing housing strategies. And so there's another encouragement there to implement the right to housing as local authorities do that. And again, the offer's open to Auckland Council to be a part of that and indeed take some leadership in that in the national sense. And I'll just jump down to the final slide. I've noted still in communication with Leilani Whaha, thinking about the things that local authorities are doing globally. Thanks, Duncan, for jumping down there. Globally, local authorities are promoting inclusionary zoning. They're curbing the trend towards short-term gig economy and doing those two things. And these are all things that Auckland Council can jump in on too with the support of community housing providers and others. So kia ora, happy to discuss any of those issues.
Thanks, Brendan. Nicely put, and thank you and the Shift Aotearoa. Brendan, stay on the line and we will go through the other contributors here today. We'll now go to Tom Gill. Tom, are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, morena, Tom. And you have 5 minutes, Tom. Would you like to proceed now?
Yes, thank you. Can you see this?
We have the first slide just coming up now. It was with us, but carry on, Tom. We now have it before us.
Thanks. My name is Tom Gill. I'm co-director, lead architect, and a future resident of the Cohaus development in Greyland. I just wanted to share some insights from the project in relation to the Council's affordable housing program. First of all, just a quick definition of co-housing, which we often get asked. And we see it as owner-led multi-unit development with multi-unit housing with shared spaces and assets. We've noticed that there is a lot of demand for this housing typology, a lot of interest in Auckland. And what is unique about it? It is private sector housing development where the developers are the long-term owners, and this alignment of incentives produces high quality sustainable housing stock and community creation, which is quite unusual. This is the location of the Cohaus project in Greyland, not far from the CBD. And just a few quick metrics about the project. We have managed to achieve 20 dwellings on a site which is zoned under the unitary plan. A compliance scheme would be 5 detached houses, so that's a 4 times increase in density. And this is the site shots taken yesterday. We're about 2/3 through the project. Quick slide about costs. The total value of the project is, the overall project value is around 20 million, which breaks down into these components. And I just wanted to mainly talk about some of the challenges the project has faced to get to this point, and then just explore some ways the council could maybe help out with those challenges for future projects of this sort. The legal complexity of a project like this is quite startling. There's no template for the corporate structure of a project like this in New Zealand, so we had to build one from scratch for ourselves and get approval from banks and lawyers of purchasing residents. Land availability, particularly in Auckland, but I would venture in most urban areas, is difficult when you're trying to buy a suitable site on the open market. We tried for 2 years and we really only succeeded because the 2 lead families were able to basically purchase the site and fund the initial development costs without borrowing, which is a pretty fortunate position that not many projects would find themselves in. We had quite a long resource consent process on Cohaus, and I think what we take out of it is that it's very difficult to have certainty of outcome. We found in the preliminary stages as to whether we were able to get the kind of consent that we needed. We estimate we spent approximately 650,000 on top of the land cost before we were in a position to say with confidence that the project would go ahead, and that money was essentially all that was largely at risk up to the point of getting a positive response during the planning hearing. I'll just skip straight to over to funding, because valuation funding are actually really tied together in terms of housing development. The dominant model of retail bank funding is pretty difficult for community-focused housing like co-housing. We had a lot of own equity in the project, but we are still dependent on a retail bank for development funding. They're dependent on valuations. Valuations do not price social capital. They put a very low value on common property, which is really the central part of co-housing developments. And the approval process is all or nothing. And in our case, we didn't get funding approval until we had a contractor on board. So just in terms of what we think council could do, or where council could assist for projects like this, land availability, inclusionary zoning has been talked about, but also access of some sort to Panuku sites or long-term leasehold options would be really interesting. During the resource consent process, we found council at times resistant to Cohaus's design for increasing residential density, and we think that given the urgent need to build more and better housing in Auckland, we'd like to see council at processing level adopt a more positive and collaborative attitude to multi-unit housing proposals by default, particularly when they're not-for-profit. And we'd suggest that having specialists within council consent processing in housing to advise other processing officers would be advantageous. And finally, funding, looking at sources of funding outside the retail banking centre like housing bonds or loan guarantees would be very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Really appreciate that. That's Tom Gill on behalf of the Grayland Cohaus, a great example of innovative housing. And we could come back to Tom shortly with some questions if we have those. So, Tom, please stay on the line. We'll now go to Samuel Johnston of the Community Land Trusts. And now, Samuel, your turn. Are you with us, please? You have 5 minutes.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Mayor. Are you able to hear me and see me?
Mayor Goff is with us, and the other councillors are with us, and Independent Māori Statutory Board members are with us as well.
Yes,
Welcome,
good morning
Samuel.
to all
we
the
can
councillors.
See you.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, without further ado, I'll try and remain under my 5-minute slot. So, yes, Samuel Johnston. I'm a solicitor practicing in property law and trusts law in a law firm in South Auckland. Last year, I completed a Masters of Laws thesis. The thesis title was The Community Land Trust in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The subtitle is A Model of Land Tenure for Community and Sustainability. This thesis won the New Zealand Legal Research Foundation's award last month for Best Postgraduate Project of 2019. So I just want to share some ideas about the Community Land Trust model as one of the innovative models as a way forward as a solution to the Auckland housing crisis. So in my slot, I want to do two things. First of all is sketch out what the model is, and then explain to the committee 3 reasons why I believe that the model should be adopted, and as a foremost option to investigate under item 8, the further work program investigating further models. So, what is a community land trust? The model started out in the US civil rights movement of the 1960s. It's more recently spread to Europe and the UK, and more recently it's made its way down to Australasia. And you'll be aware of the Hamilton City Council's adoption of the model earlier this year and the establishment of the Waikato Community Land Trust. There's a few key features of the model. The basic structure is that a non-profit entity holds the land and residents hold the improvements. And that makes housing affordable because the price of land is taken out of the cost equation for residents. Now, it's a very flexible model, and it can be tailored to local objectives, really. And so it might be primarily an affordable housing focus, Or it might have additional layers like a more community-oriented approach, for example, shared common areas, community gardens, whatever the local community is interested in. Governance is a little bit different to your conventional housing arrangements, both in the private sector and in traditional charitable housing trusts and community housing providers, because power is shared. It's a more democratic model and usually a tripartite structure, whereby 1/3 of the control is held by residents themselves, 1/3 is held by leaders in the local community, business leaders and experts, and 1/3 is held by stakeholders, for example, council or other financial stakeholders. So there's a balance in the control, but the emphasis is on control that is localized of the community land trust. And the other aspect to mention about the model is that it's one of the models that prioritizes housing's function as for shelter over and above housing's function as an investment commodity. And that was really the core principle in the start of the model in 1972. The authors of the original guide said the land trust would decommoditize the land and ensure perpetual affordability. So why should the council adopt this model in particular? Well, first of all, I would suggest that this community land trust model is a different paradigm of property, and a different paradigm that strikes at the root of all these complex issues is the only way to get a really meaningful solution to the Auckland housing crisis. Some of the options on the table at the moment that the council has researched and considered might go some way, but they will also perpetuate the ongoing problems, not really solve anything. So the Community Land Trust is an opportunity to be a legitimate institutional alternative to private ownership in the Auckland region. And really, I want to link up with what Mr. Brennan Rigby said about dignity. Community Land Trust gives residents a voice and the local community a voice. So residents have dignity and the local community is empowered. So it's a different model of ownership, and it's not inferior to private ownership, but fundamentally different. The second reason why I believe the council should adopt this model of land tenure, or at least investigate it, is because its unique institutional character creates scope for stakeholder finance and partnerships between central and local government. Now that is the model in the UK actually, whereby the UK central government supports the National Community Land Trust Network and local authorities support local initiatives. And those two approaches work together to broaden the tenure mix in that country. But through that, a key theme is that the local voice should not be marginalised, even though there's stakeholder involvement. But it does redress some of the issues that Mr. Thomas Gill spoke about, in access to finance being a difficulty for community-led developments. A third point to emphasise is that the Community Land Trust can promote biculturalism, and it's supportive of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. There are strong links between the Community Land Trust model and Papakainga, both in its vision of land itself and in the more collective approach to housing. And there's been strong interest by iwi in supporting the model. And to conclude, basically, in my work, I've done a lot of the research groundwork in tailoring the legal options to Aotearoa's legal context, and I have a hybrid community land trust model which is already developed in there, which I would proffer to the community in an act of goodwill. So I think that there's scope for further research of this model, but also I would push for action and implementation of this particular model in a pilot project. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Samuel. Interesting model, the Community Land Trust model, as outlined by Samuel Johnston, their members, and something for consideration. Please, Samuel, stay with us at the meeting, and we have two other speakers, and then we will go to questions from the members of the Planning Committee. Thank you, Samuel. Next to speak to us is Imogen Schutz from the Society for Alternative Housing Development. And I'll now pass to Imogen. Imogen, are you with us? We don't have Imogen as yet. She was with us. What I think I might do is, as we try to raise Imogen, we'll go to Ellie Croft. Ellie Croft is from Women in Urbanism. And Ellie, are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Ellie. Thank you. And would you like to proceed and take your 5 minutes now, Ellie?
Yes, that's fine with me. So I'm mainly here as an interested future resident of co-housing and also representing Women in Urbanism. And Women in Urbanism is a group of women with over 2,000 followers on Facebook and members from all over the country. And we're really passionate about creating inclusive cities. And we really think that addressing affordable housing is part of creating those inclusive cities. So during lockdown, we had a Women in Urbanism hosted a webinar with Greer O'Donnell from the Urban Advisory, and it was about community-focused housing models in New Zealand. And the event was really popular. It had it reached its 100 people Zoom limit, and we had heaps of people reaching out asking if it had been recorded. And I just checked this morning, and the recording has now had 430 views on YouTube. And so I guess repeating some of what other people have already said today is right now I think housing in New Zealand is seen as a commodity, something to make profit out of. But if we are really going to address things such as well-being and affordability issues, we need to consider housing as a human right. And our current housing situation needs to change. And I think, as others have said, there are so many other housing models out there. And in New Zealand, we really only think of three models. We think of home ownership, renting, and social housing. But if we look overseas, we can see there are so many other models, such as community land trusts discussed earlier, property cooperatives, and co-housing. And the demand for affordable housing solutions is real. And in my case, I also think that the demand for co-housing is real. I was introduced to the concept of co-housing through the book Happy Cities, but actually by Charles Montgomery, thanks to the Auckland Council and then Conversations 5 years ago. Thank you. And I'm interested in co-housing not only for the affordability issues, but also the community creation benefits. I like the fact that the collective sharing of resources in a co-housing development, such as a spare guest room, a large courtyard, a tool shed, and large spare hosting kitchens, allows people to access these amenities at their own home without having to live miles away from their workplace in order to afford them. And I think what's important also to note is that the size limit of these co-housing developments means that I think residents actually feel true ownership over these amenities, which can disappear when a development becomes too large. When I describe the basic co-housing concept to friends renting, almost everyone has responded with a keen interest to know more. Right now, I do not feel like there is many options in New Zealand for people to get involved in co-housing, or even simply a place to engage in the subject. It's fantastic to see the council is taking an intervene and lead approach to affordable housing, but I think like three main demands I'd say for council, just reiterating what others have said. I think it would be awesome if the council could allocate land for affordable community-focused housing developments. Land can be set aside in a community land trust, potentially via leasehold, so that housing developments occur above ground while the council gets ground lease payments for the land. Another thing that council could do was just creating those dialogues and conversations on what are alternative models of housing for addressing the intermediate housing markets. I think that these different housing models are generally not widely understood, and because of this, as mentioned before, I think it'd actually be a really cool even for councillors to get involved in a workshop just to talk on the conversation on what are alternative models of housing. And the third demand, I think, would be, I think it could be really cool if the council looked to invest into research on the existing and future demands of the intermediate housing market. I think understanding the intermediate housing market demand post-COVID might just give even more weighting into why we need to create / adopt new innovative housing model solutions. So today I'm here as an interested future resident of co-housing, and yeah, I really hope we can move forwards on this issue. Thanks a lot, Ali.
Thank you, Ali. Members, that's Ali Croft on behalf of Women in Urbanism and a Cohaus resident. And please, if you would like to be, that is, at Greylin. And if we could just think of the questions you might be asking the respective members. Now, we've got one more speaker before we go to the questions, and that is Imogen Schutz of the Society for Alternative Housing Development. Imogen, are you with us now? No. Okay. Look, we'll make sure, members, that we receive Imogen's submission. I'm sure she can put something together in writing and contribute it to us, so our staff will ensure that occurs. Members, we have exceeded the 30 minutes as per the standing orders, but I know there's some that do have some questions. Can I please limit the questions to one per member, please? And I've got notice from Councillor Cashmore first with a question, please. Councillor Cashmore.
Thanks, Chris. And thanks to all the presenters. Very interesting. My question is to Julie from the Queenstown Affordable Housing. What was the differential between your rural zoned land and your urban zoned land in price?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, it changes all the time. There's just, yeah, case by case, so it's very hard to put a number on that.
Yeah, the reason I ask is because when I went around and looked at those ones in Queensland, there was quite a big difference. And even when you, is it right when you say when you add the infrastructure costs, you were still under the brownfields housing costs?
Yeah, I guess we, you know, any land developer will freely admit that they won't look at a development unless there's at least a minimum 30% profit in it for them. That's certainly the advice that we hear from them. So I guess in terms of, you know, an additional payment or fee or cost to that land development, they weigh that up and then decide whether it's going to be doable or not. And every time it seems to be the case that it is. In the last special housing areas that went through, they were paying a 10% of the total sections they were agreeing to pay across to the trust. So yes, it is a big cost, but it still must be well worth it for the developer.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cashmore. Thank you, Julie, for the reply. I have a question from Councillor Casey, please.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yesterday we spent 90 minutes discussing universal design, and I was very pleased, Brennan, to see that accessibility is one of the 7 tenets at law of home ownership. But Julie, my question is to you. What do Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust, how do they address, or how do you address accessibility in terms of universal design in both your current development and future developments?
That's a good question, and it's something that we do incorporate into our developments. So we've probably done half a dozen developments to date. The very first one that you saw in the slides, we didn't incorporate any accessible design into it. But as we've evolved, we understand the need for it, and we're seeing households on our waiting list who do need accessible design. So typically we're putting probably around 10 to 15% of any development will be fully accessible. I'd love to get that up a bit higher, but at the moment it is that balancing of cost as well. And of course it's looking at our waiting list and determining what is best needs.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Casey, and thank you again, Julie. I have a question from Mayor Felgoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and can I thank all of the contributors? I found it really interesting, and if I can regard all of the contributors as maybe a potential resource for council officers and for elected representatives to draw upon. But I'm going to join with the last two questioners in overloading Julie with my questions. The questions are basically, most of your funding are coming from developers. Is that in lieu of a development contribution, or is it in addition to that? And what is the actual requirement, and how is it imposed on the developers to actually get the property passed across to your trust?
Well, that's a really good question, and one that we often get asked, but it is not in lieu of development contributions. So DCs are still paid as per the normal process. It's completely separate. How it has worked differently with respect to whether it's gone through private plan changes or special housing areas, but historically and initially the QLCHT was enabling list through the RMA. So it's in addition to DCs. I've forgotten what the other second part of your question was. Sorry, Phil.
The second part was how do you impose that requirement on developers? I presume it's not simply a voluntary contribution, but a requirement under council bylaws. But can you just elaborate on that, please?
Yes, so initially it went through the district plan, and so it was a private plan change within QLCHT's district plan that made a requirement for a community affordable housing contribution. How that worked was when developers were going through their private plan change application, they would sign up to a stakeholder deed with the council agreeing to a contribution. Earlier on, it was very much a negotiation process, and sometimes it would vary between 3% to 5%. Our council is currently going back through that process again and putting new inclusionary zoning provisions into the district plan, which they're hoping to have notified in December. And we want to get it standardised so that it's like a DC process. It's really clear to developers upfront what the requirements are in terms of affordable housing, and it could be a similar sort of process to the DCs.
Thank you, Mayor Goff, and thank you again, Julie. Now, I've got one final question. I'll take one final question, and that is from the Deputy Chair of the Planning Committee, Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm seeing some kind of working group form with the people that have presented in public forum, and maybe a subcommittee of this committee regarding affordable housing and offices. But I wanted to ask about our housing policy mix, and I'm hearing people say you don't sell the land. So what are people's thoughts around how are we supposed to do our housing mix then if we're not going to sell the land? Because that was the understanding, was you sell so that you can provide for social and affordable. Maybe Samuel could answer it. Very interested in that.
Samuel, did you hear that question from Councillor Bartley?
Good morning, Councillor. Yes, well, if you look at the precedent models in the UK, say, for how these community land trusts are capitalised, that's a good question, because they want the land, but they also want capital for development. So often in the UK, the approach has been, via some kind of plan change or planning permission. So it's so they get a transfer of value via that means. And basically, if there were finance available for improvements, and this is an important aspect of the legal design, then I think that the land would be able to be retained by council or transferred into the CLT entity. So it's a question of finance, I think, for improvements. But can you, does it satisfy your question, or what?
Not really.
No. So you're saying you want to...
That's okay, Samuel. Councillor Bartley, do you want to just put that to Samuel again then?
It was just, like how we do affordable housing and social housing with the models that we have at council through Panuku, through Tamaki Regeneration is the housing mix policy, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And I'm hearing people say we shouldn't be selling the land, but that's the only way, apparently, that we can get the capital to provide for the affordable and the social housing is by selling on the private market. So
Yeah. Well, I think the community land trust model is more of a quasi-public model than a private model, private market model. And if you look at what's happened with Papa Kainga, there's a tripartite agreement between what was Housing New Zealand, Kainga Ora, and then Kiwi Bank, and then the statutory incorporation. And so the money comes not from selling the land, which is retained, but for lending for the improvements. So I think that's the way that you're meant to get the money, rather than just selling the land. So in affordable housing, say a shared equity scheme, you'd sell a portion of the fee simple estate in the property, which the bank would take security of. In other places, in other countries, the bank might take security of only a leasehold interest, which is less than the land and improvements, but it's still a good security. So the question in this country is banks are hesitant to lend for anything other than fee simple estates or stratum estates. And so it's sort of engineering a way that you can get retain the land, but also get finance via an appropriate security and legal model. And so that public ainga finance model was one which I was interested in. Yeah.
Thank you, Samuel. I think we need a bigger conversation, and we will have that. Thank you, Councillor
Thank you, Mr.
Bartley.
Mayor.
Now, we've got Imogen Schutz is now on the line. So we've finished with the questions, members, but I think we'll go back to Imogen. So, Imogen, are you with us now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Thank you, Imogen. Imogen, look, can you take your time now? We need to proceed with our meeting, but we've reconnected with you, or connected with you. So if you could take your 5 minutes now, please, Imogen.
Thank you. I appreciate being accommodated to my technical difficulties here. Yeah, I wanted to say thank you for the time to speak, and also to congratulate Pania and the team on their hard work with all of these papers that we're considering today. So I speak as a trapped renter with 2 decades of experience, and also as a previous occupant of the housing cooperative. I'm also speaking on behalf of SARD, Society for Alternative Housing Development, and have some professional experience in relation to today's topic as well. So the Society aims to inform, educate and advocate across 3 key areas of housing. This includes co-housing, which we haven't heard much about so far today, but community land trusts as well as co-housing. So community-focused housing enables people and communities to play a lead role in addressing their own housing needs. It can play a part in meeting affordable housing supply, as we've heard so far today already anyway. It's between owning and renting, but offers a more security of tenure than renting does. And community-focused housing offers considerable wellbeing health benefits. The Society has a webinar that you can find on our site, alternativedevelopment.org.nz. And we've also got an advocacy piece there in relation to the upcoming central government election, where we've got key policy asks that we're putting forward, which align quite well with some of the things being considered today. So we note that the paper doesn't necessarily recognise yet community-focused housing as a sector in its own right, which we feel that we are, and we're becoming quite more so. As such, we are not represented in existing engagement or as a potential delivery partner in the future. In terms of COVID impacts, we see this as only increasing the demand for community-focused housing and affordable housing going forward. We note that the documents mention surplus land. We haven't seen a definition of how surplus land is mentioned. It does imply low quality and potentially poor location as well. We want to see some really clear actions and strategies that are aimed at preventing gentrification. Obviously, council rightly so invests in a number of key locations to upgrade them. In those areas, we want to see some anti-gentrification measures put in place. We're also aware that there's a lack of data on the supply of affordable housing, which we think would be great to address as well. So going forward, I think it was mentioned by one of the councillors there that we would welcome further engagement going forward, particularly a workshop possibly on community-focused housing and the role it can play going forward. I understand that possibly there's a piece of work that's mentioned in the Future Work program, where there's a piece that Panuku has developed. We'd welcome some additional support to improve capacity building, awareness and engagement across the relevant sectors to support greater uptake of community-focused housing in Tamaki Makaurau. We welcome Auckland Council using its accountability levers to set clear targets of location-based affordable housing dwelling numbers, and subsequently to monitor the supply of affordable housing in these key locations to prevent further gentrification occurring. So in terms of some of the way that was mentioned before about land being sold and possibly that being considered for highest and best use, we want to see returns on investment to include social and environmental as well, not just purely economic. So we would love to see land allocated in a strategic and targeted manner for community-focused housing across the key regeneration areas that Council is focusing on. So this could be done through a leasehold arrangement where possibly there's ground rents payable back to council. Sam's touched upon that, I believe, in his presentation and questions as well. So going forward, we recommend that Council take a really bold and brave approach on the intervene and lead approach it's taking on affordable housing, and that also would include establishing a Tamaki Makaurau Community Land Trust, and through the long-term plan, allocate funding to support the establishment of community-focused housing projects as per Hamilton's considerations currently. Thank you.
Thank you, Imogen. Now, I'll take one question. Is there a single question for Imogen? There being not, we'll proceed. Imogen, thank you so much. Bold and brave you're inviting us to be, and that's key. Thank you. Now, members, I'll just put a bundle motion acknowledging the contributors here today, receiving their input, and of course we'll make sure that our staff are in touch with these contributors today. So to Julian, Brendan, Tom, Samuel, Imogen and Ellie, thank you for these really strong contributions before the committee here today on affordable housing, the discussion that is really important for this council, and we're going to tap into the further knowledge that you bring. We can't solve this together. It does require partnership, and thank you for your partnership here today in front of the committee. Councillor Bartley, would you like to move accordingly?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you.
Mayor Goff, would you like to second? Thank you. It's moved by the Deputy Chair and seconded by the Mayor, an acknowledgement and receipt from all the contributors here today. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Thank you, members. We'll now proceed with item